All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College, and I'm pleased to welcome everybody here today for our last meeting of this class. And let me just say again what a pleasure it has been to have all of you in the class and to have so many people who visited over the course of the semester. Special thanks to Dr. Mary Evans, who arranged most of our program for this year. I think she did an outstanding job. I think almost all of you, I hope all of you would agree that she did an outstanding job in inviting some really top-notch speakers to come. It's been a very rewarding series, and so I've enjoyed having you in here, and I appreciate your engagement, the questions that you've asked, and your responses. I particularly enjoyed reading the papers dealing with the Library of Congress crowdsourcing project. I found it really interesting. I enjoyed participating in it myself, and I was pleased to read your experiences and what you got out of it. So today is day 2 of student presentations, and we have 3 speakers today. I'm going to give a brief introduction to all 3 of the speakers, and then I'll ask them to come up in order and talk for about 12 minutes and maybe take 1 or 2 questions after speaking, and then the next person will come up. So our first speaker is Audrey Creel, who is a history major with minors in art, history, and chemistry. She plans to graduate in December of 2020. Her thesis title is The Untold Story of the Manny Family Slaves, a case study of slavery in Murfreesboro. And her thesis was directed by Dr. Lynn Nelson. One interesting fact about Audrey, she writes, I spent 3 weeks participating in an intensive United States history program at the College of William and Mary. Our second speaker is Josie Dowd, who is an animation major with a minor in art. She plans to graduate in May of 2020, and her thesis is titled Bug Planet, an adventure into speculative biology and interactive media, directed by Rick Lewis. And her interesting fact is that she has a pet millipede. All right. Honors College. We love it. We love it. Okay, our third and final speaker today is Josiah Ediger, who is an audio production major with minors in music industry, video and film production, and interactive media. He plans to graduate in spring of 2020. His thesis is titled Levels and Leitmotifs, Creating an Immersive Experience Through Video Game Music. And his thesis advisor was Matthew O'Brien. One interesting thing he says about himself, I've written music for an interactive online game as well as for a senior animation project, and I'm looking to continue writing music for video games after graduation. There were so many great thesis defenses this year and different honors theses. We are especially grateful to our 3 students who are here today to talk about their projects. So with no further ado, we will invite our first speaker, Audrey Creel.
Well, hi. Like Dean Phillips said, my name is Audrey Creel, and the topic of my thesis was the untold story of the Manny family slaves. The Manny family was a wealthy family that lived here in Murfreesboro. The main home that they owned was Oakland's Mansion, and it's open today for tours. It's about 5 minutes away from campus, and the Manny family was connected politically to just about everyone here in Tennessee. They were connected to the governor of Tennessee, Newton Cannon, and they inherited the land from the namesake of Murfreesboro, Hardy Murphy. As an influential family in Murfreesboro, they were also large slaveholders. So they owned somewhere between 200 and 250 slaves total. But only about a third of the slaves that the family owned lived here in Murfreesboro. And so this is because they owned several cash crop plantations in Mississippi. And so the slaves that they owned here were trained in different crafts because they weren't necessarily doing field labor. So for my project, I chose to focus on those 60 enslaved individuals that lived here in Murfreesboro, and I followed them through the Reconstruction era. One problem with my research before the Reconstruction era is there just isn't any primary source material in order to conduct intensive research. The enslaved African Americans, they had no access to keep records, and the Manny family didn't really keep records either. Here I just have some statistics about slavery in Rutherford County. You can see in Tennessee, slavery grows exponentially between 1840 and 1860. And because of the number of slaves that the Mannys owned, they were within the top 1% of slaveholders in Tennessee. For most of my pre-Civil War research, it was mostly census records. So on the left, you can see a census record that shows slavery as it existed in 1860. This is how they kept records before enslaved African Americans earned their freedom. And so this shows that Dr. James Manny owned several slaves in Mississippi. And the most that these will show is just that slaves were given a name, or they weren't given a name in the census, they were just given an age and what gender they were. So this is, again, another reason why it's difficult to research these individuals before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, most of these individuals took on the last name Manny. There was only one Manny family in Murfreesboro, so I used the assumption that any African Americans in 1870 with the last name Manny who were older than the age of 10 had most likely been enslaved by the Manny family. And so using that assumption, I was able to track about 55 African Americans through Murfreesboro into the 1920s. And the second census record that I have shows two brothers that were living in Murfreesboro. And interestingly enough, on the same page of this census record, their former owner was also listed. But at this point, they were given a name, and you could also see occupation as well as other family members that these people had that were living in Murfreesboro with them. After I made these assumptions about people living in Murfreesboro with the last name Manny, I chose to focus on two specific individuals and followed their families specifically. The first person that I chose to look at was a man by the name of James Madison Manny. And before the Civil War, he states that he had been enslaved by the Mannys in Mississippi. And during the Civil War, he actually followed his owners through the South and was a bodyguard for his owner. And so he has Confederate pension records because he was forced to work for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he moved to Murfreesboro, where some of his family was. And he actually was able to purchase a home just about a mile away from Oakland's. And he lived in that home until he died in 1932. He married and had several children in Murfreesboro. And even though he was able to own land, he was still listed as just a farm laborer. Later, he became a miller. But he never had a specialized job in Murfreesboro. And this was pretty common for African Americans during this time period. They just had farm labor jobs usually. So they did not necessarily specialize in the aspects of work because they hadn't been given that opportunity before emancipation. But James is actually one of the few African Americans in Murfreesboro at the time to leave a will. When he passed away, he did write a will, and he left his home and all his possessions to his wife and his 3 daughters. But his daughters did not stay in Murfreesboro. They realized that Murfreesboro was not a place that they were going to be able to obtain better jobs or let their family kind of grow and flourish. So they moved north. And this was another trend that is pretty common in African Americans, where people will stay close to the plantation where they had been owned, but their children will leave in search of other opportunities. The documents here are just a few of the documents that I used when I was researching. One of them is a land grant, so this actually shows me where James purchased his land. So this tells me who he purchased it from, as well as where the home was and how much he purchased it for. And so using that, I was able to find his home. It's not still standing. There's just a park there now, but that was a valuable resource, and it also gave me some insight into where he might have worked, because he purchased a home from someone that was not the Mannies, which led me to assume that he probably worked as a farm laborer for this family instead of the Mannies after the Civil War. The other document is a death certificate. And at first glance, these don't really look like they're going to give you a lot of information, but this gives me his age when he died. It also tells me where he was buried. It tells me what his occupation was, as well as who his spouse was when he died, which sometimes is not the same as when he first gets married. So if you can look at the death certificate and see a different name as a spouse, then I knew that I had to go back and find another marriage certificate somewhere. And the interesting thing about James was he listed himself as an engineer. This led me to assume that he was probably referring to his work during the Civil War, because none of the work that he did after the Reconstruction era had anything to do with engineering work. But before the Civil War, he worked in a Confederate plant, helping to make guns and other types of weapons for the Confederate Army. And so I believe that the reference to engineering work here was actually a reference to his pre-Civil War work. The other individual that I researched was Wesley Manny. And Wesley, he leaves an interview right before he passes away, where he discusses his life at Oakland before the Civil War. And the quote that I have here is one of the last things that he said before the interview was complete, where he talked about how all the African Americans knew that freedom was coming, they just didn't know when, and the slaveholders told them that it wouldn't come. So when they finally got their freedom, it was just even greater than they could have ever expected, because they had constantly been told that they were never going to attain that freedom. His story is also very interesting because his family was separated by the slave trade. His father was actually owned by the Mannies, but he and his mother lived about 8 miles away from Oakland's. And he writes in his interview that he remembers that his dad would only come to visit on the weekends, and then he would have to go back to work. And he also discusses several different aspects of his work that he would have to do, including keeping the flies off of his owner. But after the Civil War, Wesley also married and stayed in Murfreesboro, and he's listed as a farm laborer until the 1900s, and he actually returns to Oakland, where his father had been enslaved in the 1800s, and he worked as a servant for the second family to own the home. So again, we see this pattern that African Americans immediately after the Civil War were not able to break this pattern of work that resembled the work that they had before emancipation. And again, his children actually left Murfreesboro. They stayed in Tennessee. They didn't move north, but his son worked in Nashville as a banker, and his daughter actually became a principal of a school closer to Smyrna. So they were able to kind of leave that pattern that their parents hadn't quite been able to break. And then once I had all that information, I was able to discuss the community that was formed in Murfreesboro. And the Mannies actually presented a different pattern than most African Americans in Murfreesboro. They created a special community right in front of Oakland's that is a mix of both African Americans and whites. The other predominantly African American community was right outside of Murfreesboro, whereas this one was right in the middle of town. So the chart that you see is actually showing the demographics in Murfreesboro. So you have whites as well as those who are listed as African American and those who are listed as mixed race. This is the 1910 census. So there are certain streets that are all African American, like Evergreen Street, but then there were other streets, like Bell Street, that were all whites. And so you can see that these communities did kind of mix together in a way that was a little bit different from other communities in Murfreesboro. And they also established a few churches in Murfreesboro. Mount Zion Missionary Baptist was one that Wesley Manny helped to establish. And it still stands today and still has a fully functioning congregation that meets every week. But with that, do y'all have any questions?
Yes, James Madison died.
His death certificate just says that he was old. He had gotten old. He might be the one, he had some kind of surgery. I think he probably had cancer. But his death certificate just says he got old. Yes.
What led you to select this topic?
So I work at Oakland's part-time as a tour guide, but I also had experienced a tour in Virginia that discussed slavery in a very modern setting, somewhere you wouldn't think about slavery. And so I decided to start looking into that at Murfreesboro because I knew those stories existed and I just wasn't looking for them. And so I picked a place that I was familiar with, but also didn't know those stories, and started looking for those individuals.
All right, thank you, Audrey.
Hello. I'm Josie, and my thesis is called Bug Planet, which probably sounds kind of silly and way different from the last one. So I have decided I made a book about a lot of creatures that I designed when I was younger, but I re-examined them through the lens of speculative biology, which I'll talk about in a minute in case you don't know what that is. So basically the book is like a guidebook, sort of like a zoo books kind of thing, where you can examine each of the animals and learn about them. And then to tie into my animation degree, a lot of them can move on the page. So since this is an interactive media project, if you'd like to download the app, this is a QR code because it will work, it should work in the middle of the presentation. So you can do that for a second if you'd like. But yeah, a lot of these animals that we're gonna see are things that started out as very small, weird doodles and all kinds of fun stuff in just scrap paper and sketchbooks in high school, middle school, elementary school, all the way back. So I actually have some of those old drawings you'll get to see too. And if you don't, I'm gonna go ahead, but if you don't pick up the QR code, it's called Artivive. And I decided to use a pre-done service because developing an entire app would kind of be another project on its own. So that's what it's called if you wanna look at it that way. All right, speculative biology, what is it? So I really like this definition from Darren Neisch, which is the idea that we might be able to guess or imagine those creatures that could evolve in the future on other worlds or in other timelines. And one of the first major works in this genre was Dougal Dixon's Afterman, which these are pictures from his book, which he wrote, and they actually had someone else illustrate it, but he had his own illustrations too. So it doesn't have to be on Earth, but his book was about an idea of a future on our planet where mankind died out, and then the animals that came back were things that evolved from rabbits or rats or the survivalist animals. So that's sort of what his was about. Mine is on another planet, so I just kind of started from scratch having fun. But when you look at these things, it probably feels like a zoo book or an animal encyclopedia to you, and that's exactly what it should feel like. I have some examples of things in the genre that you might remember. And here's a little reading list. I have this at the end so you can take a picture if you'd like. The Future is Wild, All Yesterdays, the Ology books. These are all examples of spec bio, also called spec zoology and other things. So it's just kind of like looking at animals and creations that aren't real, but as if they were. So I'll start by showing you how I designed a creature. And this page does actually scan if you want to try it. So this creature is called Plains Hopper. And most of my animals started from childhood drawings, but this one in particular, I built with the idea in mind that it would be a prey animal in its environment, right? So I wanted a prey animal, and I wanted it to feed on nectar and flowers. So I took inspiration from a lot of things in nature that already exist. The kangaroo rat, which are very fast. They have a high metabolism, so they have to eat a lot. Kangaroos have these special enlarged toes that help them jump. Hawk moths have very long proboscis for drinking nectar. And this is a dinosaur with vestigial arms because I don't think they really need them. So I take a lot of inspiration from nature and sort of move it around into its own thing. I'll take you through designing a page like this. I've chosen an animal called the tetrad, and these are some old drawings of mine from like when I was 13 to 16. You might be able to tell because they're a little funky looking. So these are all my original things. And they have a lot more features than the final one does because when you're a kid, you kind of just keep adding stuff on to look cool. But when you start to think about it through spec bio, you want to think about form and function and why it would have those features and what they would do. So I got rid of a lot of things that are extraneous. And here is our new fellow. And this is my pencil sketch of it. And if any of you have ever worked with digital art, this process will be familiar to you. So that's just a scan of my drawing. Clean it up a bit, add the colors, and there's a page from the book. Well, not the whole page, a cropped version. So, and I gave him a scientific name as well, add the authenticity feeling. So he's come a long way from the one I made when I was a kid. A lot more streamlined, less extra bits that are just for fun, you know. So this animal is sort of like the coyote or fox of its ecosystem. Small predator, long tail helps it balance when it's running, short snout, short teeth, pretty standard. So the next part is how the animations work. So I have to make this into a puppet. And so I separate all of the pieces into little sections that overlap in a sort of circular way. And that way, when they rotate, it doesn't like clip into itself. So that's all the puppet layers, which is kind of a fun look. And then I also have them all spread out. So each leg was made of like 5 parts. And you'll see when they move that it's bending at these joints in between the parts. So to animate these, I used a free program called Doic, which is a plugin for After Effects. This is an example GIF they have from their website. So what you basically do is you build a skeleton, just like a real skeleton, which is adding even more of the sciencey lens of this, and attach your art to it in layers. But in the menus, you go in and you have, and here I've chosen arm or front leg, and then I pick digitigrade, which is the second one, a dog-like leg, and the number of parts I need for which bones, and then I get this structure in the program. And then I can drag those onto my guy and line them up where I need the joints to rotate from. So this one's pretty simple, only 4 legs. I have a couple creatures with more that took a lot of time. And then after you've built the skeleton, it creates controllers for you. So I have a control for the head, the shoulders, each of the paws, the hips, body, and tail. So I'll let you try. Here's the page from the book, which hopefully will scan. But I also have the video in here in case it's being funky. Just trotting. And this loops on the page, so you can view it like on the page of the book, which you'll y'all could check out at the end here. So here were a few other ones that were some of my favorites. Same process of cutting up the art into little puppet pieces, adding bones, and I think the fun part is that you can see it on the page, which makes them feel a bit more alive, hopefully, than just a drawing. But yeah, these three are in the book. It's the fantail, the scoop stilt, and the tall dancer. I won't have it online because I'd like to publish it, but you can check these out with me afterwards, and that's my email. And that will be my website. Today's Cyber Monday, getting those deals. You know, websites are expensive. So yeah, if you have any questions about it or the process, have at it.
Where did you get your melody?
The Exotic Pet Expo in October.
Like, is it hard to take care of?
No. No. They just eat old vegetables and bark.
Why you're interested in biology?
This will explain a lot. Both of my parents are biology teachers. So I always was out in the woods looking around for critters, and a lot of the stuff we watched, Planet Earth, documentaries, it's always been a big part of me. So I try to incorporate that into my art whenever I can.
Any other questions?
What's the name of your millipede?
Miriam. I'm glad you guys thought that was cool.
Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Josiah Ediger, and I love video game music. So I did a thesis project about it. Let's talk about what makes video game music so cool. So unlike the challenges that come with writing normal music, video game music is it's a very unique medium in the sense that when you are writing music for video games, you are not in control of when your music is going to start, when it's going to end, or what's going to happen to it. The person who gets to decide all of that is the person playing your game. So you have to make music that's adaptive, and you have to make music that is able to fit whatever situation might be on screen. So you end up with a sort of non-linear musical composition process. And not only that, but you have to make it so that your music is fully interactive. Easy example of this is, for instance, if you've ever played a video game where the character goes underwater, you'll notice that the sound often muffles itself to sort of emulate that you are actually under that water. And in that way, the music has to be able to morph and change to match whatever situation's going on. Yeah, it's designed to match whatever state the game might be in. A game state is essentially just the embodiment of everything that is in a moment of a game. And it includes what you're seeing on screen, what you're hearing, what's in the programming, although the player can't really see that, and animation cues and things like that. When you put all these things together and use it to control your music, this is what's known as adaptive music. Just to give another example, you might, for instance, visit one particular key area in a game at multiple points throughout a big story arc. Let's say you play this game for a few hours. When you first start the game, you'll go to this town and everything might be really cheerful. There's nothing really going on in the story. But then when stuff gets real and maybe the game gets a little darker, you might come back to that same town, but the situation has changed. The location will look different and it should sound different to reflect that. So the music has to be able to adjust itself. Now what's really cool, what's the coolest thing in my opinion about video game music is this big old word, Ludo Musicology. Ludo Musicology is a two-part word. Ludo is Latin for game, and musicology is the study of music. What's really cool about this study is that it's very, very young. I could count the major people who have worked in this field with like 2 hands, maybe more. It'd probably be about 20 to 30 people altogether. But it's new, which is really exciting for me because I feel like I'm on the start of something that really hasn't gotten its feet off the ground yet. I have an opportunity to contribute to this field before everyone figures everything out, which is pretty cool. Video game music is really ingrained in our culture nowadays. I think that people are remembering video game music much more than they used to. Video games in general, of course, you see more advertisements for them now. They're in almost every household at this point in some form or another, to the point where we can play certain songs and everybody recognizes what they are. And I'm choosing an easy one for this, but if you know what the song is, raise your hand. Instantly. Yeah, it only took a few seconds. This is the Super Mario Brothers main theme. It's been around for years and years and years. Everybody knows what that song is. So, video game music. It seems like it's a pretty big deal. I guess we should look more into it. So let me talk about what I did for my thesis project. First thing I did is I interviewed a bunch of people. I interviewed people who work as independent artists. I interviewed people who work for bigger studios. And I even talked to people who will help hire composers for another company. So in those interviews, I basically wrote reports on each of them, which included information about how to harness your creativity, how to survive financially as a freelancing composer, the typical career path of what a video game composer, sound designer, or audio programmer might look like. Generally, when you're a music person, you can't expect to graduate and immediately have a great paying job. A lot of the people who are in this are in it for the long haul, taking 10, even 15 years to be able to do this full time. You have to learn to price yourself to clients fairly, which includes not only not overcharging, but not undercharging. A lot of creative people out there have self-esteem issues, imposter syndrome. Everybody deals with it. And one of the biggest tips that any professional will tell you is whatever price you're charging people, you could probably double it. It'd be okay. I also wrote 4 original musical works, although I'm only going to show 2 of those here today. And I did a musical analysis of each of those songs, as well as some existing songs, that show the way that video game music can be unique. And it explains it in a way that a musician with a basic level of knowledge can understand it. My goal is to be able to essentially have a way for someone who is an ordinary musician to get into a new hobby, to get into a new field, to be able to go into the world of video game music confidently. So let's talk about some of the things I learned from my interviews. And these apply for most jobs, I feel like. First thing is to be diligent and disciplined. A lot of people, if they're practicing their skills at being a musician, it requires daily training. Now this can only be 5 to 10 minutes a day. I spoke to someone who said that spending about 5 minutes a day analyzing some part of music, whether it be a whole song or just one little cool part, he said that it helped him to recognize patterns in music and to have creative ideas come to him more easily. He would create part A in his music, and through this practice, he'd come up with what needed to come next much more quickly. Practice makes perfect. The more you practice, the better you'll be. Also, you need to be patient and shrewd. Whenever you are a musician, oftentimes it means that you're on your own. You're an independent contractor, you're a freelancer. You're going to go represent yourself as a business. It's very uncommon nowadays for video game composers to work with one specific company. It's very rare for a company to say, I want this guy and I want him or her for all of the games that we create. It's much cheaper for them to hire per game. So you have to be able to notice and recognize when a job has a red flag that you need to avoid or when it's going to be a great opportunity. And like I said before, sometimes the quality of jobs you're going to receive are going to slowly increase over time. When you first start out, you're going to have to take most of the jobs that come at you, and then you can choose the cream of the crop once you're more experienced. Lastly, you need to be intentionally selfless and pursue integrity. The thing about creative industries is that it's all about who you know, what your connections are. It's about who you are, what you are like to work with, more than what are you capable of. A lot of the people that you meet are going to want to not know necessarily too much about how skilled you are. They want to make sure you know enough for whatever project they'd like to hire you for, sure. But a lot of people want to work with people who are enjoyable to work with. So you have to learn to focus on serving others and doing good work. Whenever musicians go to events, I always tell them that the best thing they can do is not to make connections, but to make friends. Because that way people will remember you, they keep your number in your contacts list, and opportunities come rolling in. So let's transition now. I'm going to talk about an old game. I'm going to talk about Banjo-Kazooie for the Nintendo 64. Now, does anyone here know what this game is? Oh, a few of you. All right. So I'm talking about a particular level in this game. It's called Click Clock Woods. This stage is very unique. I think it was one of the first games to have a mechanic like this. Essentially, the level has 4 versions for each of the 4 seasons of the year. We have spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And the music changes to match each season. Each song has a different instrumentation and exhibits a different overall atmosphere to match the season. So I'm going to go through them one at a time, starting off with spring. Very fun song. The person who wrote this music, named Grant Kirkhope, as you can tell, he used a lot of creative compositional techniques. Here, he's integrating the sounds of the animals into the music itself. It's very high energy, everything's alive, you can hear all of the animals. If we were to move over to summer, it's a lot slower because it's getting hot, all right? The heat is coming down, life is slower paced. The song is now a waltz. It has a different instrumentation in order to match the atmosphere of summer. So move on to autumn. You can notice now the instrumentation is much more barren. A lot of things now are dead, and as such, the presence of the forest animals is a lot less outside of this frog, and the instrumentation is much less packed. We move on to winter now. Everything sounds very light. The sound of this mallet instrument, along with the bells that you can hear playing chords, kind of exhibit the feeling of snow, in a way. This is actually a very common instrumentation used for winter themes in video games, so you'll hear this in a lot of places. Now let's finish this up. I'm going to show off 2 songs that I composed for this project. This first one is titled The Ancient Sunken City. I wrote this one envisioning an underground ruins, essentially kind of like Atlantis. The goal of this song is to show how music can be used to match an atmosphere in a game, sort of like as I was showing with Click Clock Woods. So I'll go ahead and play it now. You'll notice the song kind of flows onward. All the instruments are very washy. They're not punctual. Everything kind of drifts from one idea to the next, sort of like the flowing of the water. I wanted to create a sense of peace with this song. Those of you who are having trouble staying awake, I apologize. So that's the first song. The second song that I'm going to show you today is one that is titled Golden Retriever Rush. Now, I wrote music for an online Twitch stream, if anyone here knows what Twitch is. It's essentially a live stream where a broadcaster can send an image and send a video feed to their audience, and the audience can communicate with each other and with the streamer through a chat. This game essentially uses messages typed into the chat as commands that the people in the audience can use to interact with each other's characters as well as with the game itself. This game is called Don't Kick the Dog. It is a psychological test where they try to make you treat the dog nicely unless you're evil. So for this song, you can see that it has a very retro artistic direction, and in order to emulate that, I wrote what is known as chiptune music. Chiptune music is designed to emulate vintage hardware. This is talking about your original Sega Genesis, Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as NES, all of those original sounds. This kind of music has become very popular recently with indie titles especially. I think a lot of indie developers find it's easy to make pixel art games, and so those pixel art games need similarly retro music to go with them. It's designed to have be art through limitations. Because they're trying to emulate old hardware, they have to face the same challenges as those original composers faced. Someone who wrote music for original NES had limited polyphony, essentially meaning they could only play a certain number of notes simultaneously, say 4 or 5 usually at most. And also they only were able to use specific waveforms. Now by waveforms, I'm essentially talking about triangle waves, sine waves, square waves. If you've taken a physics class, just the drawing of a waveform that kind of looks like this. They basically only had 4 or 5 of those to work with, period. And the combination of those that were available to them depended on what hardware they were working with and what sound chip that hardware was utilizing. Like I said, today it's often used in indie games, and how do composers nowadays write that kind of music? Well, they use a program called FamiTracker. This is what it looks like. FamiTracker is a lot more code-centric than music-centric in a way. Everything is hexadecimal, meaning it's based on a 16-value system. You essentially have these columns for the different instruments that can be played, and each line splits up time passing by. So every time you see code on that screen, it's representing a note being played or something that is manipulating the way that note sounds. FamiTracker is a combination of Famicom, which was the Japanese name for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and Tracker, which is the type of software this is. So, just to finish up today's presentation, I will show you my song, Golden Retriever Rush. And this song is designed to be exciting. It's designed to last for exactly 1 minute. It was designed to go when this special bonus happened during the live stream. Every player only had 60 seconds to earn as many points as possible. So this is designed to hype you up for that. So here it is. Does anyone here play Galaga? All right, now for this presentation, I hope that you all learned something new, that you go listen to video game music, because there's a lot of great stuff out there, especially if you're one to do some studying. I've heard that music without words helps, so maybe listen to some video game music next time. Anyway, thank you so much for letting me give this presentation to you. Have any questions?
Have you ever played the game Stardew Valley?
I have. That's a really cool game because the person who made that game did everything himself. He did the art, the programming, the music, everything. Yeah, he's incredible.
What video game music are you inspired by?
See, now the thing is, I'm a bit of a Nintendo junkie. I grew up on a lot of Nintendo, and I'm guessing that's kind of obvious from that second song there. I'm inspired by a lot of stuff all the time, though. I have a lot of friends who are actually composers, much older than me, and I love listening to their work, and I love discovering new things all the time. I especially like music from indie games because oftentimes they're not trying to make the typical, make it sound like a movie idea. It's not full orchestral. They can do things that are more experimental and more fun, especially games like Fez and Super Meat Boy are some good classics for that kind of music.
Have you played Celeste?
Heck, yes, I have over 100 hours into it. I play it all the time and I love it. Yes, you get bonus points for mentioning Celeste. Any other questions?